Politicians do say that high immigration makes us richer, but is that actually true? I talked a short while ago to my second expert, Leith van Onselen, co-founder of macrobusiness.com.au. He's an economist who has worked for both the Australian and Victorian Treasuries. Leith van Onselen, thank you so much for your time. Does high immigration make us richer?
Well, it's a good question. If you measure the economy the incorrect way, which is how all economists and all politicians do it, you just measure it in aggregate terms, sure, it makes importing a whole bunch of people increases the number of people, increases the outputs, and makes the economy larger. So in that sense, it does boost growth, it does make us richer. But if you measure economic growth the correct way, which is per person, there is absolutely no evidence to show that immigration raises per person wealth.
But there is also actually a cost to high immigration, which our politicians rarely talk about. And I'd like to take you through some of that. For instance, the most obvious, you bring in more people, you need more roads, more rail, more bridges, that sort of stuff. Have you got any idea of what sort of cost we're talking about here?
Yeah, look, it's huge. I mean, you only have to look at Melbourne. Melbourne's the population growth leader. We've added 1 million people over the past 10 years, so 26% increase to the population. And the official projections from the state government are to add 3.4 million people over the next 35 years. Now, I'll just to give you an idea how big that is, it took Melbourne 200 plus years to hit 3.4 million people in 2001. And we're expected to somehow add Melbourne from 2001 to the current Melbourne population size in just 35 years. Now, I ask you, where's all the additional train lines going to come from? Where's all the additional roads? Where's all the additional aged care facilities? Where's all the additional schools? Currently, there's no plan. Right. In built-out cities like Sydney and Melbourne, to add an extra unit of infrastructure requires tunnelling, it requires land acquisition, buybacks, all these sorts of things. So in order to add more infrastructure, it becomes increasingly expensive. We end up getting diseconomies of scale. Now, economists always say, oh, if we increase the population, we get economies of scale. We get more output. We get to spread our infrastructure over more people. But in Melbourne and Sydney's case, it's actually the opposite, because the cost of tunnelling, the cost of land buybacks is simply so high that infrastructure becomes prohibitively expensive.
And the comments you made about Melbourne, that also apply, I guess, to Sydney and to a lesser extent to Brisbane.
Yeah, if anything, it probably applies more to Sydney because Sydney's more land constrained. It started off from a worse infrastructure position. But Sydney too has added almost 800,000 people over the past decade. And the plan for Sydney is to add 1.7 million over the next 20 years. So to effectively add another Perth to Sydney's population, 1.5 million of which is going to come from net overseas migration. So I'm not saying we should do this, but if we cut net overseas migration to zero overnight, Sydney's population would only rise by about 200,000 over the next 20 years.
And you're not even talking about simply the amenity of a city, as in the hassle of having the roads fuller, the beaches fuller, having to drive further to get out to the countryside on a weekend, all that kind of stuff. Let's talk about another cost, high immigration. How does that affect house prices, particularly in Melbourne, Sydney, and again, to a lesser extent in Brisbane, where the immigrants tend to go?
Yeah, look, it does have a huge impact. If you look at the past 5 years of house price growth, you've seen Melbourne and Sydney go through the roof. And you've seen the rest of the country pretty much stagnate, or in the case of Perth and Darwin, go backwards. Now, it's funny that the house price growth almost perfectly tracks the immigration. Sydney and Melbourne had a massive population boom over the past 5 years, and their property prices have gone through the roof. The other nations haven't had the big immigration intake. Their property prices have stagnated or fallen.
It's true too. So there's another issue. Is there evidence that bringing in so many people, one of the highest, I think the highest category, is skilled immigration? So businesses apply to government for a permission to get skilled immigrants to come out here to do the jobs that they can't find Australians to do. Has that made us lazier in terms of trying to train up our people to do the jobs that we import foreigners to do?
Yeah, look, it's not just the 130,000 strong skilled permanent migrant intake, it's also the temporary migrants intake, which is basically uncapped. Now, there is certainly an argument that it has made businesses less willing to train up locals. It's a lot easier just to go and import someone from overseas, pay them less than what you would otherwise. which of course holds down wages. So yeah, from an employer's sense, it definitely has made them more lazy, and it's a lot easier just to go and tap a worker from overseas rather than focusing on utilising your existing workforce better.
Well, let's do a counterfactual sort of thing. So here we have had the whole political class and most of the journalistic class go with the idea that the higher immigration makes us richer. And that Japan is usually pointed out as the example of what you do get if you don't have high immigration. They've got almost none. They have got an ageing population. They've got a shrinking population, and they've had sluggish growth when measured as a whole. So do you look at Japan and say, well, maybe I got this one wrong then?
Yeah, look, it is funny. Throughout the 1980s, economists were fearing the rise of Japan, as a threat, and now they keep talking about the fall of Japan and how it's got a dismal economic future. But when you break it down to that per person level, Japan's actually doing very well. Japan's per capita GDP growth has been a little bit lower than Australia's, but you've got to remember, Australia's been through a mining boom. We've been through the mother of all housing booms. Japan's a small island nation that has almost no natural resources, and yet it's the biggest creditor nation in the world. It has the third biggest car manufacturing industry in the world. Its unemployment rate is half what Australia's is. And
that's in part because it's been training its own to do jobs that we would import people.
Yeah, that's right. And also Japan boosts its productivity by automation, whereas Australia...
Robots and things.
Yeah, exactly. And there's actually a very interesting study that came out earlier this year by economists at MIT. And they showed that ageing populations have actually performed better in a GDP per capita sense than non-ageing populations since 2000. And this is all because the ageing populations utilise automation better, which boosts their productivity. So the whole ageing myth, it's all a bit of a joke. And also, it doesn't work because if you import a whole bunch of migrants to overcome population ageing, in 30 years' time, those migrants grow old, and then you have to repeat the process over and over again. It's nothing more than a Ponzi scheme.
And of course, Japan has got the benefits of a cultural, societal sense of being all in it together. A Japanese, a community feel. They've got lower crime rates, no radicalisation problems. It seems to me that they're not someone I look at and think, that's not what we want to replicate.
World-class infrastructure and world-class internet, and also almost no homelessness.
Leith van Onselen, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.